So besides being my favorite professor at Orono, Dr. George Jacobson is one of the founders of the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. And he was the director of that institute for almost a decade. His scientific research is focused on forest responses to climate changes during the past 60,000 years. He served as a board member and chair of both the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Society of Maine. He was an external advisor on climate to the Ferguson Science Foundation and the Finnish Academy of Sciences. From 2008 to 2014, he was our Maine State Climatologist, our first one. He's now retired from that job, but as you can see, we keep pulling him back by popular demand. So, Dr. George Jacobson, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Chloe. It's an honor to be here, and I mean that sincerely. Some of you may be tired of seeing me because in looking at my speaking records, 11 years ago exactly yesterday, I gave a talk to this same group. And Chloe had me speak to the Penobscot Bay stewards this summer down in Searsport, and that was fun, and I think at least one or two of you were there. But I have different things to say each time, and we will proceed. What I'd like to do really is give you an overview of how we learn about the Earth's past climate and what we've learned about it and what the implications are for the future. And you might be surprised that they're not quite what you think. Our institute was founded in 1972. It originally had the name the Institute for Quaternary Studies. Quaternary is a geologic term representing the last 2.6 million years, which has been the time in which the Earth's ice ages have occurred. And we proudly had this title for a long time until somebody convinced us that nobody knows what it is, so why don't we change the title to something that people understand? So we did. But what's really interesting, I came within the first decade of the Institute, and one of the reasons I've been so thrilled to be there to this day, even though I retired 15 years ago, I'm still active, I still have my office and publish papers and so forth. But the colleagues I have are involved with climatology, history, paleoecology, which is my end of it, paleolimnology, which is lake, the past environments in lake, archaeology, glacial geology, and so forth, all the things you see listed. And the ability to spend my entire career among people who are tops in their field, and I mean tops in their field, and to hear them talk about their work has helped me to have a very broad understanding of how the Earth has functioned for thousands of years. And I think they probably have learned something from me along the way. So it's been a tremendous fun collaboration. We do work all over the world. We have field sites from Maine to the Arctic, Greenland, and so forth, to the Antarctic and South America and New Zealand and Australia and so forth. And one might ask, why does it matter that we have research sites beyond Maine? Well, it matters because if we are going to try to understand the Earth's climate, we need evidence from all parts of the Earth. And we also use information that others gather from the oceans about what oceans have been doing through time. And so we're able to piece together through many lines of evidence what the conditions have been like in the past and the interactions among various processes. Each project we work on has a specific, rather narrow topic and question at its beginning. But I always look at our institute's work collectively as dealing with the question I've written here at the bottom, which is to understand the natural variability of the Earth's climate and what causes that variability. And I think probably don't need to explain this, but the reason we need to understand the natural variability from ice ages down to finer scale variations, is that if we don't understand what the natural conditions should be at a given time, we have no way of putting in context whether what's happening now is unusual or not. And as you'll see, it's very unusual, and you already all know all that. Everybody alive, if they pay attention, knows things are happening that are unusual now. But it's still absolutely fascinating science, and I hope to share that with you tonight. Our institute has workers all over the world, faculty, graduate students, and even undergraduates. Brenda Hall, who's third from the left here, was getting off this plane in Antarctica 5 years ago when they still could go down there. The conditions for doing work in the Arctic and Antarctic are still very poor thanks to COVID and other problems. But Brenda took 2 graduate students and an undergraduate student down, and they did a field season together in Antarctica. And Brenda is one of the top glacial geologists in the country and the world, very highly respected, even though you have to even poke her to get her to talk to you very much. But she is an incredible scientist and a great person. Chloe knows her, I'm sure. Our institute has been involved in quite a few things. When I retired in 2008, rather, I was asked to become the first, or the Maine State Climatologist. And it was, I describe it as an honorary position since I got paid nothing. But I decided to make use of it, and I developed some projects that I thought might be useful for helping people of the state of Maine understand what we have learned about the Earth's climate. And starting in 2009, at the request of Governor Baldacci at the time, we prepared 3 reports called Maine's Climate Future. 2009 was the first, 2015 was an update, and the 2021 is an update. And this one in particular is really good. And if you're interested, you can go to our Climate Change Institute website and download it. It's only 75 pages long. It's got fabulous figures. I mean, it's beautifully put together. And so that's one thing we've done. People in our institute have played a central role in the state's planning for its climate, it's climate action plan, that's what it is. And the scientific part of it was very heavily supported by scientists from our institute, including the current state climatologist, Sean Burkle, Ivan Fernandez, who's a soil geochemist and soil scientist, and others who all have a great expertise relevant to Maine and its forests and its climate and so forth. And I'll show you some evidence from their work. And one other thing that's happened recently is that we've been part of a really interesting new book that was just published in August, and called Our Maine. Exploring its rich natural heritage. That's not a very clear, shoot. What did I do? Where do I do this now again? There we go.
While you're doing that, I want to butt in for just a second.
Yeah, please.
I have that book, Our Maine. It's hot off the press, and it is so good. And it's beautiful, even just for a coffee table book, but it's not huge. But it's George has written chapters about paleoecology and climate change and geology. But it's got lots of input from lots of people, and it's a fabulous story of Our Maine.
Is it at Left Bank, or where do you get it?
Yep, I got it at Left Bank. It was on the shelf, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It says on the flyer, in bookstores everywhere, so I doubt it's everywhere, but at least in Maine it ought to be there. But it just came out, and initially there was a 30% discount, but that was prior to its publication, which was about mid-August, so that doesn't work anymore. But I found it just to check. I went on Amazon today, and it was on there too. But local bookstores are, of course, much better places. But we had a great time doing it, and Steve Norton, a geologist, colleague of mine, was the first author of the geology chapter. I was first author of chapter 2, which is about climate, and the editors asked us to essentially lay the groundwork for the rest of the chapters, which are all about specific natural parts of the natural system, maybe alewives migrations or vegetation on top of Katan, and all written by people who absolutely love the topic they wrote about, and wrote about it in a very nice personal way. It's not written as a scientific publication or something. It's written to connect with people, and I believe it's turned out pretty well that way. Now, one of the things that we know is that here in the larger Northern Appalachian Acadian region, it's called an ecoregion, we have a tremendous variety of topography with the mountains down to the sea. We have very different geological settings and very different climates related to nearness to the ocean and things like that. So these are all, this region we're in, which is much less disturbed than almost anywhere in the rest of the world, is a very important center for for biodiversity at this latitude. It's very unusual to have such a place globally. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how we can think about this setting as we move forward and take advantage of its characteristics to ensure high biodiversity in the future without really changing the way we live very much. Now, you've all seen these maps from the USDA about plant hardiness zones. When we go to one of these nice, Plants Unlimited or somewhere like that, the plants all have these little things that say what growing zone it's in, and it's important for us to look at it because one that grows in Rockland doesn't necessarily work in Orono, for example, so we have to pay attention. But this is I like this figure, and I mean this kind of map. I put in the corner of figures that are in the book. I've put the little book there so you can sort of tell I've used those figures. But I like this map. Somebody asked me once, what would be one figure that would best describe Maine's climate? And I decided that this was it, because the hardiness zones describe how severe the winters are. That's what they're all about. That's what determines really which plants can grow where. And for scientists traveling all over the world to come here to Maine, if they can look and see that the winters in northern Maine are cold and have a lot of snow, and they're from Finland, they can get the idea this is about, they understand what that means, and in a very simple way. And but this is of course changing through time as climate has changed in the past naturally and more recently. But one of the fascinating things about Maine, which as we know has extremely high biodiversity and very interesting different kinds of ecosystems within close proximity. We can, from Orono, I can drive to the coast in an hour and go out on an island and do things, or somebody here could drive up to Bigelow, or in a longer drive up to Fort Kent, and the climate will be so different and the ecosystems will be so different. And this is highly unusual, that we have this kind of diversity of ecosystems packed into a small space. And what I'm trying to show in this figure is that in 4 degrees of latitude from north to south, that box around Maine captures the growing zones that occur in Maine today. And in the central part of the continent, the same growing zones go from northern North Dakota to central Kansas. Isn't that interesting? I mean, who would have ever thought? And if we take a trip farther east and look at Europe, there's Maine in the lower left corner, same 4 degrees of latitude. And the ecosystems, and biologically, it's equivalent to northern Finland to central Poland. That's 20 degrees of latitude in Central Europe. That is all compressed, that kind of climate variability is compressed into Maine, which is really why we're able to have such diversity of places to visit. We take it for granted because we know we can drive a short distance and be in this really different place, or climb Katan, or people can't do this. almost anywhere. So it's part of why we're so lucky to live here, really. But it's also fascinating when we think about what happens as climate changes in Maine and what does that mean for our systems. One of the aspects of the steep climate gradients in Maine, which of course go from warmer in the south to colder in the north and warmer in the lowlands near the coast to colder in the highlands where the mountains are, is that species range limits get compacted together as well. And this figure is a representation of where, I forget how many, maybe 60 or 100 range limits reach either their northern or southern limit in Maine. And it's easy to see that northeast-southwest band and recognize that as the topographic change, or the barrier. But the interesting one is that one that comes up from the western side of Maine up to about the Penobscot River and down here. Isn't that amazing how compact that is? And there are, I think there's something like 70 wood, these are all woody species too. And the ones that occur in that southern part of Maine, I could be using my clicker here. The trees that reach their northern or southern limit here often are ones that are Appalachian species that go all the way down to Georgia or farther. They're the northern extent of a lot of species that grow all throughout the Appalachians. Excuse me, I keep going the wrong way. Okay. So anyway, I'll come back to this later when I talk about some local work here. Now, we all know that the climate has varied a lot, even during our lifetimes. Almost all of us are old enough to say that. I know I am, and some of you are at least as old as I am. But this is the mean annual temperature of Maine, and the zero line there is the average baseline for the last century, 1900 to 2000. And so there's not much mystery what's happening here, is there? It's quite obvious, and this has been produced by Sean Burkle, who now runs the Maine Climate Office and is the state climatologist. This is one of the figures in the book. And I point this out because these earlier decades in the 20th century were obviously much colder. I mean, on average they were much colder, but the cold points, mean cold points of some of those years was very low. And we know from news accounts and photographs from places like Carver's Harbor in Vinyl Haven in 1918 that those harbors were frozen. And the boats were immobilized for some period of time. People could take cars and horses and drag things out on the ice if they wanted to. But that was Carver's Harbor. Here's a photo, copy of an article from the Telegraph, wherever that's from, about southern New England harbors are impassable, and including Nantucket and places like that. So it's not even just Maine. Nantucket, imagine that enclosed in ice so that boats couldn't go there in 1918. And here's one that some of you may recognize. This was a photo taken in 1905 in Belfast Harbor when the ice had frozen substantially. And what's shown here is some teams of draft horses pulling scoring devices, or things that have a sharp edge that can score the ice so that it can be broken up so the icebreaker can even start to get in there to open up the harbor. But so it's such an unusual thing, and that happened in these harbors as late as what's it say back here? 33, 34. So that's what that arrow is. So during all this time, the harbors in Maine and even in southern New England were freezing up, not every year, but it was not unusual to see that happen. We've never even remotely seen it in our lifetime, have we? And certainly, some people alive today certainly were around then and might remember it. But what's happened in the last 7 decades, and this, of course, we're still missing the first. Well, this is about up to the present. But these last years, since about 1980 especially, have been extremely warm, and we read about that all the time. But here's the evidence from Maine about how true that is. It's quite striking, really. This is the yearly annual temperature, changing from time to time. Well, we know part of why the changes occurred since about 1980, and that's because we've been adding carbon to the atmosphere. You've seen this figure before, obviously. Since about 1850, which is generally the date assigned to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the massive burning of coal for producing energy for the industrial age. And this is an interesting figure, partly, of course, because what it shows us about what's been happening to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from just from 1957, really, up to the present. But there are a couple of people I'd like to note here tonight, and one of them is a fellow named David Keeling, who was a faculty member at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California. In the 1950s, there were no satellites, there were no ways to have remote sensing of the Earth, to have almost any idea what was going on at the same time globally. Now we get weather maps, and we can watch the radar across the Pacific and the Atlantic and see storms coming. Nothing like that was available. So geologists and geochemists decided that, they decided to propose that significant amount of scientific research money be spent to make measurements of everything in 1 year, all over the Earth, so that there could be at least a snapshot picture of the relationships of things on the globe. There'd never been anything like that. Well, David Keeling thought it would be a good idea to measure CO2 in the atmosphere because nobody had ever done that before. There was no way to do it. And he proposed from La Jolla that the place to do it would be out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on top of one of those high volcanoes in Hawaii, and because it would be distant from all pollution sources and things like that. Well, he was turned down. No, that's not important. We're not going to do that. We're spending our money on other things. But the reason he's a hero in my book is because he stuck to his guns and did it anyway. He just went out there and started making the measurements. And after not very many years, everybody realized the importance of it. So now it's a huge deal. But that was somebody who had the courage to stick to his convictions when nobody else paid any attention. And that's an extremely thing important in life. It's important in science, but it's important in life because sometimes we have ideas that seem strange to others, but in fact we're right. And we shouldn't give up on them. We shouldn't. And students have to learn that. That's one of the key things about doing science in particular is that if we think we have a good idea, our job is to test it and find out if it can be disproven. But if we've really hit on something important, we have to stick to it and make that case successfully. Well, the amount of carbon coming into the atmosphere has been increasing enormously. And during the same time, this is the these are the plant hardiness maps from 81 to 2000, and the bottom one was from 2000 to 2020. And just the difference between those two decades stretches of time is quite striking, isn't it? I mean, look at the changes across here and in Maine. There's been a dramatic change in the severity of winter conditions on average during that whole time. And of course, this then affects plant distribution and starts to allow plants to change their range a little bit, expand to the north or whatever. So this is something that happened really as a result of, at least in part, this change in atmospheric CO2. Another person who I consider a hero in this regard is a Swedish scientist named Svante Aranius, who was a PhD student at the University of Uppsala in about 1880s, I think, or early 90s. And he was studying chemistry, and the topic of his research in chemistry was electrochemistry, which we now associate with how batteries work and electroplating metals and things like that. We take for granted all those things. But it was not understood. The relationships between chemistry and electricity were just not known very well. And he worked on all of this, and the professors in his department thought he was nuts. I mean, they thought he had no idea what he was doing. They gave him no credibility. And he came up for his PhD exam, and the process in Europe is especially Northern Europe, is quite different. Here we have an exam with faculty from the department, and all the students come to hear Chloe give a talk about her work, and then they ask some questions, and then later on the committee, which is a group of about 3 to 5 faculty members, go off to another room and ask the student a bunch more questions, and then congratulate him or her on the work. Well, in this case, it's not the same. It's all done by outside examiners. It's quite a frightening thought, really, for most American grad students. In a Swedish university, in Finnish, Norwegian today, it's exactly the same. When a student is done and considers their dissertation prepared to be defended, it has to be published. So it's usually published in a soft cover form about this big with quite a few pages. And then it's distributed to everybody in that field throughout Europe. And anybody who wants to can come and be there at the defense, which is called a disputation. It's actually a Swedish word, but that's what it is. And the disputation is run by somebody called an opponent, who's a famous scientist in that field from another country, who comes in to do it. I've done it a few times. It's fascinating to watch. And so anyway, he distributed his dissertation. The faculty almost wouldn't let him defend it, but they did. So he defended it, and finally they decided, okay, well, he's not going to amount to much, so we'll give him his PhD, but he won't do any harm. Well, until about 2 months later, about every scientist, every chemist in Europe was coming to talk to him. And pretty soon, about 7 years after that, he got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So he knew something that other people around him didn't, and he stuck to it, and he was right. But in the context of climate, he's very interesting, because once he was busy working on all of that into the 20th century, he realized the significance of accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from burning of coal. And thanks to work by a couple of previous people, first of all, a brilliant woman scientist in America named Eunice Newton Foote, who you should look up in Wikipedia, seriously, had figured out that greenhouse gases, the certain chemicals, CO2, methane, and such, H2O, could trap long-range radiation, infrared radiation, and heat the Earth. And there was a British scientist named John Tyndall, who 3 years later made the same case and got all the credit until about 5 years ago, when everybody figured out that actually he got his ideas from Eunice Foote. So anyway, the usual. So anyway, Aranius decided this was important enough back in the early 1900s to step away from his work on chemistry. And he spent 10 years going around giving talks like this to explain to people the dangers of burning all the fossil fuel, because he said in some future time there would be a hothouse Earth, he called it. We call it greenhouse, the effect. But he thought it would take 500 years. Nobody imagined the rate at which we could extract coal and then oil and put it into the atmosphere. So he had the time span all wrong, because it would be unimaginable to think that by within 70 or 80 years of that time we'd be where we were. But he did that, and then after that he went on to have a fabulous career as a famous epidemiologist in medicine, so he's quite a guy. But I really think Keeling and Aranius are role models for all of us, because they knew something, they stuck to it, and they didn't take no for an answer. And that's when we're at least when we're right, that's a good thing to do. Not everybody who does that is right. Well, let's look back in time a bit farther. This actually isn't a satellite photo. It's a rendition of the Earth 20,000 years ago. But it shows how much ice was present in the northern hemisphere and shows where we're sitting under quite a lot of ice here. And the ice flowing from these major ice sheets in Europe, Greenland, Eurasia, and Siberia. And of course, most of that has gone, and that has led to changes. That ice melted because various things happened at the end of the Ice Age. And the Ice Ages began, the Ice Ages as we recognize them now, began about 2.6 million years ago in what is called the Quaternary Ice Ages. This is the Quaternary period of geologic time that I was mentioning earlier. And here we can see the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere starting about 5.5 million years ago, slowly declining until 2.6 million years ago, the conditions were cold enough that the Earth began to have these regular ice ages. And for the first about 1.6 million years, they were all roughly 40,000 years apart, 41,000 years cycles. But in the last million years, they've been 100,000 year spacing between the ice ages, and the ice ages themselves have been greater. You can see the vertical extent of those changes. And so we live in that period today. And this time scale is flipped here, but here's the last 800,000 years on the right end and today on the left end. And here are all those oscillations that we showed on the previous one spread out so we can see them a little bit. But it looks like sort of a saw that foresters would use to cut down a tree. But the ice ages are characteristically slow to develop from the peaks of warm time. And this is an important key, is that the warm times are very short. And if we look at today, which we call the Holocene period in geologic time, this is the time since the last ice age, that the previous ones all were about 10 or 15,000 years, no more. And then the Earth descended back into slowly after over about 80,000 years into the next ice age. And the ice age, the maximum for that particular ice age is the lowest point of this white space here. And then in every case, there's an immediate, very rapid melting of the ice in transition into an interglacial time, such as the one we have now. And so here's the last glacial maximum, we call it, for the most recent ice age. I showed you that rendition of the northern hemisphere. That would be at this time. But it took only about 6,000 years for that ice all to disappear and forests to cover the landscape and all kinds of things to happen. So part of the mystery of the Ice Age is what causes all these changes and how does it happen and why is the termination of an ice age so fast and things like that. And those are the kind of things we've been working on in our institute to this day. And I'm still doing it myself. But we find out things about the past by studying different kinds of evidence, and sometimes it's studying places where glaciers have been and collecting the ages of the moraines that were left at the greatest extent of ice, or there are many ways to do it. Another way, as you know from the media, is from ice cores, which are continuous collections of snow that is compacted to form hard ice in places like Greenland and Antarctica and a few other places on Earth. And this is from one of the field sites in Antarctica where these long cores going down, sometimes 1,000 meters or more, are collected in sections like this, brought back to the lab. We have a special building up in our region of campus up here that is cold enough with all kinds of backup power and everything so that these things can stay frozen. They're infinitely valuable by the time they're collected and brought here, but they're studied for many. Yes, please.
I'm curious, is he wearing the mask because of the cold or because of possible microbes from the ice?
Not microbes from the ice, but everybody's being sure. He also has gloves on, And the idea is not to contaminate the ice, because when those are brought back to places like our campus for people to study for years afterwards, we don't want the ice having chemicals on it that came from today. We want they're always studied from the inside anyway, not on the outside, but it's for that reason. All precautions are taken to prevent contamination. Yes. Now here's a figure that shows the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, again from the last 800,000 years. So here are those ice age periods that you recognize from what I just showed you. The previous ones I didn't say were based on cores from ocean sediments, and different evidence from the ocean show those. But here's from CO2 trapped in the ice cores from Antarctica. And so here they are, and I've drawn these green lines here because those are the boundaries, essentially, of natural variability during the ice ages. That's how much CO2 is varied from the top to the bottom during the ice ages. And so that puts in perspective what's happened more recently, namely this change from about 285 parts per million in 1850 to 423 parts per million, which is up here last summer when I took this. I copied this measurement from a website that the Scripps institution has. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things, this has happened so fast, and the amount of change in CO2 in the atmosphere already is at least as much as the changes during all the ice ages were, from an interglacial to isn't that something? I mean, we're really changing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide traps heat, and no matter what anybody says, it's a very simple thing to understand why it's getting warmer. And here's actually a matchup of the amount of CO2. The red line on top, red curve on top, is CO2 against the temperature, which is based on those ocean sediments cores. And you can see how well they match. And it doesn't mean that changes in CO2 cause the ice ages, but they are part of the story of the adjustments of Earth going into and out of ice ages, and they're certainly part of the story. Okay, here we are again. And so what happened is, let's think about how we come out of an ice age and what that means for Maine. Well, here's a figure from our book again, and this is a series of maps that I'll show you here that show when parts of Maine became free of ice. And it turned out about 16,500 calendar years ago, the top of Katan was coming out, the top of Acadia, MDI was coming out, and there's a little pond up there called Sargent Mountain Pond that I hope some of you have visited. And we cored that a few years ago, and it turned out, we think it's the oldest lake that was accumulating sediment in the state of Maine. The reason it's true down here is that as the ice approached its edges, the thickness wasn't as great as it was in the center, where before this period, it was 100, maybe half a mile more above the top of Katan, and it had already thinned out quite a bit before we got to this point. But here we are at, and what also shows up are the Lucerne Hills and the Dixmont Hills that, because the ice was thinner, were sticking up, and they're pretty notable features, of course. So here we are today. Now moving up, and of course, I took this photo. Sometimes say that one of my senior colleagues, who's now dead, took this picture of Katan when he was young, but that's not true. I took this in Antarctica, but when I saw this, I thought, I have to have this picture, because I knew that in talking to classes about the thinning of the ice and the exposure of these high peaks.
You were just a little kid when that picture was taken?
Yeah, really. And so were you, no. But anyway, this is roughly what it looks like, and so that's Katan was. Katan was really just sticking out, and as I often say, it would have been much easier to climb then. You're already almost at the top before you start, if anybody got there, but they didn't. But here are the maps. It's slightly out of focus, unfortunately, but in the book, these are a series of maps that show the climate I showed you this one, 16,500 years ago, 15.5, just go through here up to 10,000. And you can see about every 1,000 years, there's a lot of change in the nature of the amount of ice and the type of vegetation on the land cover. The brown is treeless tundra. The lightest green is woodland with only poplar in it. It's actually a poplar that grows in the Arctic. And then there are mixed woodlands with, oh dear. I'm getting out of sync here. Here we go. Anyway, and then full forests, including deciduous species, starting to come in. And still, we know we have high places in the White Mountains and in Bigelow and places like that, and in Katan, where we're still tundra, I mean treeless conditions. So those things persisted through time because of their high elevation. But this gives us, and this is an up-to-date series of map. A colleague and I published a version of this in 1985 that gave the big picture, but there's so much more new information that Brenda Hall, who I mentioned earlier, was nice enough to help put together these maps and help me get it right. And so these are up-to-date maps of the deglaciation of Maine and how the vegetation moved in. Now we find out a lot about the vegetation, of course, by looking at lake sediments. This is an expedition we had in 2007, coring Sergeant Mountain Pond up on, high up on Mount Desert Island. And these are this is a core of lake sediments, 1 meter long, and typical of what lake sediments look like almost anywhere. I mean, at least at this latitude, they're sort of brownish, greenish mud that consists mostly of the remains of algae that have lived in the lake, so other organic matter, pollen grains that have blown into the lake from the surrounding landscapes and sometimes farther away. But there's a lot of pollen in the lake, and in fact, 1 cubic centimeter of mud from that core right there would have possibly 50,000 or more pollen grains in it. So, and the pollen grains come from the vegetation living in the general area, and so we're able to reconstruct for each layer that we study what the assemblage of plants was there at that time, and we can find out what the times were by using radiocarbon dating to get the ages of the core. So that's been done in many, many places now. There's some beautiful pollen grains of the kind I spent hours and hours and hours seeing through a microscope, but I won't go into that part. Grad students do most of that. But, and these are some maps. When enough maps have been produced for individual sites with the quality of data we need, then it's possible to map out distribution and abundance of the plants that were there and what their ranges were and how many there were. And these are three maps that, 3 of 6 maps that we published in a paper, in a chapter in a book in 1987. And this particular version of it was picked up and used in a famous ecology book for decades, just showing the changing expression of vegetation on the landscape from essentially the last glacial maximum up to the present. And you can see for the spruces, the oaks, and the pines, they're constantly changing. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. So we can think about, as these things keep changing, as these change and as the amount of ice changes and so forth, what does that mean for the other parts of the ecosystems? For example, how do migratory species of birds behave? What do they do under these different conditions? The vegetation that they might need is in a different locality, or the place they go now is covered by ice. So obviously there's massive reorganization of all these things. And we can talk about the migratory flyways, the range of Atlantic salmon, which is now Penobscot River east, going up into Canada, and in fact invading new rivers on the east coast of Canada as the climate gets warmer. There used to be lots of salmon in the Hudson River and Connecticut River, but essentially those are too warm now. And so we have essentially the Penobscot River east, but new rivers getting salmon farther north because it's now warm enough for them. And so forth. So this is the kind of thing that we need to understand to figure out the consequences of changing climate, whether natural or somewhat human-aided. And here, I'm going to show you an example of spruce forest, just because it's kind of fun to look at, and illustrative, I think, of what I was just mentioning. This is a Parula warbler, a chestnut-sided warbler, and a spruce grouse, all of which are characteristic of boreal forests. They occur in Maine, but anywhere there's boreal forest, often these things will be present at the right season. And so let's look at spruce now. And the dates are at the top, but don't look up there. Look down here. There's the ice, and there's the darker the color means the greater density of that group of plants on the landscape, in this case south of the ice. And you notice that Florida looks a little peculiar here. That's because sea level had fallen between 120 and 140 meters below present at the peak of the last ice age, and that's because so much water was taken out of the oceans and stayed on land as ice that the world's oceans fell by almost 500 feet. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's a huge amount of water. And so the continental shelves around the US and other places all over the world, including Florida, were all exposed, and plants and animals were living on them. Every once in a while, dragging fishermen bring up a piece of a mammoth tusk or a log from something that was growing out there during this time. It's quite common, really. But what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to go through these fast, so it'll be sort of like a motion picture. But I'll read the dates, and you just follow what the spruce is doing relative to the ice and so forth. And be sure to watch for times when things are either stable for a while or changing rapidly. And then we'll discuss it when I'm done. So 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, today. So when were the stable times? There weren't any, were there? Isn't that amazing? Every single 1,000 years it was changing a lot. But it's kind of interesting to go back, because as the climate got closer to modern, around 8,000 years ago, the boreal forest, which had been just south of the ice, but as the ice departed, it was still too cold for the boreal species to move in there. And it wasn't until about 7,000 years ago that the boreal forest, as we know it, all across northern US and especially Canada, began to come into existence. So 7,000, 6,000, 5,000, 4,000, 3, 2, 1, today. And so what we recognize is the modern biomes and their positions have more or less come into focus in the last 7,000 years. But even then, the combinations of species present differed a lot from today. So there are lots of interesting twists on this story. Now, I mentioned, some of you know Molly Schoffler, who lives in Northport. Do you? Anybody? She was one of my PhD students and finished sometime around 2002, and was just a wonderful student. I had dinner with her tonight in town. She couldn't come because she's on the, I don't know what it is, the town council of Northport, and she had a meeting. But she did a very interesting study of very small sites that could study this history of the spruce stands at those sites today. And she was able to sample at a scale where she could identify just the immediate area around the little tiny water bodies, a small tiny little pond or something. And she studied these ones along the coast on Idaho and in the what's today the national park up to Schoodic, and then went up on Rock Island. And she compared that to the interior of northern Maine in an area in Big Reed Preserve where there's an area of about 5,000 acres of forest that really was never cut and is now preserved as part of a nature conservancy holding. But maps of the spruce that Molly produced and her data about the development of these spruce stands is real interesting. I won't go into it too much more, but Here's one that I think is really telling. If we look at her data, we can see that from 1,000 years ago, there was very little spruce in Maine. There were a few little patches of it. That doesn't mean there were no spruces, but in little micro sites. 500 years ago, the spruce had begun to expand to the south, but it's really only in the last 500 years that the extensive spruce fir forests, as we think of them today, developed. Isn't that something? How recently that was. People think of it as the forest primeval. Well, primeval was about the time Europeans got here, if you want to think of it that way. So this is her work is extremely interesting. Paper that she published in 2002 is very highly regarded, and I'm very proud of her and the work she did. I learned a lot from her. And part of the reason that this area along the coast retained spruce, I didn't point it out, but there's a little area right along the eastern coast here that is rather unusual. It's an area, Ron Davis wrote a famous paper back in 1966 about the spruce fir forests of eastern Maine. And it turns out that there's a band of spruce forests that persisted throughout this entire time. In fact, you can see a little bit of it here. Even though throughout the entire last 10,000 years, there were spruces growing right along the eastern coast of Maine. And that's because the cold water from the twice daily overturning water in the Bay of Fundy started a journey down the coast, as it does today, as cold water. And it took about till it got to Penobscot Bay before it started to warm up very much from the sun. And so this whole area along here was cool and moist, while the interior of Maine was not. And that allowed these special coastal stands to exist even when in the interior spruce was not abundant. So, well, now we know that the changes that have occurred in the last 200, well, since 1850 are large, and that things are changing. What do we make of that in terms of the landscapes, and what do we think of it particularly in terms of conservation? And this is something that is a tough one, because we're all here because we're interested in landscapes and maybe belong to a land trust or a member of the Nature Conservancy or the Forest Society. We like to think about the natural systems functioning properly, and we'd like to be part of helping make that happen. And so there are lots of ways to do it. But when we think about the climate changing, not only as much as it did, what can we learn from the changes of the last ice age, for example, to today, when we have all this rapidly changing spruce forest as it got warmer, for example? But now, as we know, it's going to get warmer. And so what does that mean? How do we approach conservation? Well, I would like to, if you'll indulge me, finish with a personal account of how I came to think about this the way I do today. And involving the approaches to conservation biology used by the Nature Conservancy. In 1987, I was first author of a paper that came out in a journal, and I showed this earlier when it was from an ecology textbook, but these are some of the raw data produced in a great big fold-out figure. And it shows the changes, and you can't even see the names of the species here, but it doesn't matter. But the species are color-coded by primary color. So there's yellow and red and blue, and when yellow and red overlap, they turn to orange. I tried to do this with other colors for a while, and then finally somebody reminded me of what we learned in about second grade, that you have to use primary colors. And it worked a lot better. I felt so silly. But anyway, here we are with 3 different sets of taxa, this group, and this group, and how they are related to one another on the landscape. We're just looking specifically at those. We're not trying to understand the whole landscape, but did they behave the same way? Even though today they're in recognizable patterns of boreal forest, little patches of ash and elm, which are sort of in the lower Great Lakes region here. And they all have the same kind of, and hemlock is there. And foresters think about these ash hemlock forests. That's one of the way foresters talk about forests. Well, if we go back in time and look at whether they were in the same relationships, we can see they weren't until quite recently. There were times when ash was extremely abundant and times when elm was extremely abundant in ash, but not with hemlock and so forth. And then finally, over the last 6,000–7,000 years, they've fused to form what seems to be a natural association, but that's just because of the way the climate is now. There's nothing magical about the way it is now, it's just the way the climate is now, and as it changes in the future, those taxa will move to different places. Well, what happened right after I prepared these figures, and I had them on my desk, and I asked a colleague of mine named Malcolm Hunter, Mac Hunter, some of you know him. I'd just given a talk to the wildlife department, which was his department, and he wasn't there, which kind of irritated me. He was probably away. So I saw him on the sidewalk and I said, "Mac, you weren't at my seminar." He said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I was away, but I've probably seen it already before, haven't I?" I said, "No." So I took him right to my office and we laid this out on a table, it's about the size of that table there. And he just stared at it for about 5 minutes, didn't say a word. And he said, "This is terrible." He said, "This means we're doing it all wrong." And what he meant by that is thinking about strategies for conservation and biodiversity. Because up to that point, up till this paper came out, which is this one, Ecology and the Coarse Filter Approach to Maintaining Biological Diversity, which Mac became first author of immediately after we left that room. About 2 weeks later, that paper was done. But he realized that the Nature Conservancy approach to, a strategic approach to conservation, choosing conservation lands made no sense, because what they had done was to institute a complicated classification scheme for ecosystems and sub-units of that, and they mapped them out all over the earth, and their goal was to try to protect examples of each one, which kind of makes sense if you were dealing with species, maybe. But what this showed us, what this figure showed us, was that the present configuration has no meaning. It's going to change. It changed in the past, it will change in the future for two reasons. One, at any particular stand there will be succession going on and the stand will get older and change for that reason alone, but the vegetation is always catching up with the changing climate, and so plants and animals change their ranges in response to the climate and how it suits their individual case, because they're not the same. Almost no species have the same, plant or animal have the same exact climate space that defines their existence. And so it just happens that they coincide for these things right here, but didn't back here, and they won't in the future. So what Mac understood, and I knew he would, and it so led to this paper, was that choosing specific examples of ecosystems and certain assemblages of plants together made no sense, because there's no intrinsic value really in any particular configuration. It's just one of many on the way to changing to something else through time in the past and the future. So we wrote this paper to make that point, and one of the figures in the paper is this one, which is a schematic diagram of what might happen, for example, if we have species A, B, and C that each has its own climate space. And by climate space, I mean generally you could say temperature and precipitation, the envelope in which they can live. And they're different from one another. And as the climate changes over time from, say, if we start here at the lower left end here, none of those species would be present. And as the climate went this way, gradually forward in time, well, yes, 1,000 years later, it might be encountering species A and C, so they would be in the assemblage that happened to be there. As it moved past A, then only C would be there, and then pretty soon C and B would both be there, and then finally it would be past B, so none of the three would be there, but on the same site. See, does that make sense? These are just Venn diagrams of the kind kids learn about in school, but this is just to illustrate why it made no sense for the Nature Conservancy to assume that everything would stay as it is today. So what we talked about in this paper was alternatives to thinking about how to make biodiversity high, even in the face of change, whether it's natural or human-aided, as is happening now. And so what's happened now, and we prescribed in this paper, that instead of looking for the assemblages of organisms, we look at the diversity of the setting itself. So we might, size is a function, the smaller sites aren't as useful as large ones, but if sites have, for conservation, have a lot of diversity in elevation, let's go on to here, elevation, geology, topography, climate, and so forth, these will accommodate all of these species, even though they're organized slightly differently on the landscape. And these are the settings that will provide high biodiversity as long as there is enough connectivity to let the species ranges change with time, which has happened easily in the past. It's a little harder today in most of the world because of, huge agricultural lands and so forth. But that's not so much the true here. But the idea of thinking of the setting rather than the assemblage then takes precedence, and the idea of then having connectivity over the landscape broadly, even on working forests such as we have in Maine and New Brunswick and so forth, the basic matrix is one in which different organisms can still grow, and they have a chance of expanding over the next centuries and so forth to still be highly biodiverse, but not the same exactly as they are now. And, and that was adopted almost immediately by the Nature Conservancy as their approach to land selections for reserves. And there's a fellow named Mark Anderson who now works for the Conservancy, who wrote a paper in a little bit, well, in the last 15 years, I guess, that tested our ideas in this paper with real data from sites around the landscapes in various places, and found that exactly what we said was correct. It had to do more with the setting was what brought the biodiversity, not the particular assemblage, and assuming no change. So it's now globally the way Nature Conservancy initially approaches its possible sites for reserves. And what that means for us, I think, and this is the last few sentences, well, a sentence actually, of chapter 2 in the book, and you can read it, but although the new landscapes can look a lot different, and different from anything that's existed for the last 20,000 years, they'll still be beautiful and wonderful to behold. And I think this is a very important point, because we're all concerned about what's going on with the world and its climate and what that means for the ecosystems and so forth. Well, things are underway that we can't stop for a while, even if we tried, which we haven't done yet. And, but we still have a spectacular place in which we live. Whether it's exactly the way it is today, or whether it's changed 1 or 2 centuries from now, if we happen to be alive that long, it's still going to be a spectacular place to enjoy, and with highly diverse ecosystems and beautiful landscapes. And I thought about that this summer when I was talking to the group in Searsport. I think it's a huge problem if we spend so much time worrying about the change and how we're going to stop it, and don't appreciate what we have right around us. You know, in our lifetimes, this won't be fixed. And if we don't take time to realize every single day what a special place Maine is and how beautiful a place we live, and fortunately without too many people, thanks to blizzards and black flies, we have it mostly to ourselves. And but it's something that I think we all have a moral duty to try to help improve the situation and reduce carbon emissions, but so far we haven't made much progress with that. But we still live here, and knowing, it doesn't detract from it, knowing that it was different 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, does it? You know, it's beautiful today after being different and beautiful in a different way then. Well, the same will be true in the future. So the message I've taken to myself is that I will not fail to appreciate the beauty of Maine landscapes and ecosystems a minute I'm alive. And even though I'll try to help make the world a better place also. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention.